If you are new to this podcast, which has been running for about 8 years now, over 8 years, normally the show is structured like this. We start with a kind of cold open. Now, I admit that sometimes the cold open goes 20 minutes, so it's not exactly a teaser, but that's the intention. I tell you one story, then we cue the opening theme song. I welcome you to the show. I freestyle it for about 10 minutes, talking about whatever's on my mind. Sometimes I throw in a smaller story, more of an anecdote that I thought was not worthy of blowing out into a full segment of the program, but I still was excited to share it with you. Then we take a break, and then we have a longer second story. That wraps up. We cue more music. I give you the end credits spiel. I say goodbye. And we come back next week, health permitting, if we're lucky enough to make it another week in this crazy world. I've certainly told you enough stories about great ball players dropping dead in the prime of life that we shouldn't take anything for granted. We should be pretty comfortable with that idea by now. Now, the reason that I tell you that about the structure of the show is that I've really got only one story for tonight. Why? Well, because Shohei Ohtani just pitched 6 shutout innings and hit 3 home runs. And it's hard for me to do both at the same time, both talk about history and witness it. I kept thinking about an exchange of letters between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, who at that time still liked each other a lot. Later, Churchill, I think in particular, got frustrated with Franklin, and they weren't necessarily still the best of pals by the time FDR passed away, although everyone involved had to pretend. But before that, they really did enjoy each other. And despite the fact that the world was totally immiserated in the years that they did know each other, Roosevelt was chuffed enough by the relationship to write Winston and say, "It is fun sharing the same century with you." I kept thinking it is fun to share baseball with Shohei Ohtani, to be a fan at the same time that he is playing and doing things that no one has ever seen before. A friend of mine texted me as Ohtani was coming out of the game. Again, 3 homers, at least one of them hit as long and as hard as any that you're going to see or are likely to see at Dodger Stadium, and 6 shutout innings. And he said, "Has anyone ever had a postseason game like this before?" And my answer was no. I mean, look, Reggie Jackson hit 3 homers in a World Series game. If you're as old as I am, then you were around for that. But did he pitch? Did he ever pitch? The stuff that Ohtani does regularly, Babe Ruth only really did for a year or two. I happened to be looking earlier today at a Yankees game from the mid-50s, from 1954, a year that the Yankees were beaten out to the pennant despite winning over 100 games by a Cleveland team that set a record for victories in a single season. And it happened. This was one reason why they didn't. Every loss counts, right? Well, in late May, they played the Washington Senators, a bad team with an ownership that just wasn't trying, and they dropped a 1-0 game. Whitey Ford, one of the better pitchers of all time, without specifying where he ranks, he's up there against Johnny Schmitz, who wasn't one. He threw curveballs and changeups on his curveball and more curveballs. And there's nothing wrong with that. And Johnny Schmitz had a long career with some good years. He was a lefty. They called him Bear Tracks. And you know, if you've been a baseball fan for any appreciable length of time, that sometimes your team will come in scoring 10 runs a game and a lefty junk baller will somehow just shut him down. And that's what happened to the Yankees that day. Yogi Berra, 0 for 3. Mickey Mantle, 0 for 4. I could read you the whole box score. It would sound exactly like that. Schmitz went all the way on a 3-hitter, no runs, 1 walk, 2 Ks. Meanwhile, Ford allowed a first-inning run on an infield single, a bunt back to the mound by Eddie Yost, which he then threw away. So Yost made it to first, advanced to second on the error. 1 out later, Mickey Vernon, sometimes a great player, sometimes a terrible one, singled to left field, that's the opposite field, for the lesser Mickey in the game, scored Yost, and that was it for the afternoon. That was the game. Ford went 8 innings, allowed 7 hits, that 1 run, 1 walk, 6 strikeouts. Great game. Johnny Sane came in relief, pitched a scoreless inning. Didn't matter. Now, as I said, this sort of thing happens, but if you're manager of the Yankees, Casey Stengel, you're trying to win your 6th consecutive pennant. You've just pitched your ace, a guy nicknamed chairman of the board, against someone whose nickname sounds like a Ben & Jerry's flavor. You do expect to win. And he was rather annoyed. First, he was annoyed because he was ejected after that very first play for arguing that Yost ran into his own bunt, or the bunt ran into him after he was out of the batter's box, which would have been an automatic out. Mostly, though, he was annoyed at the upset of Schmitz out pitching Ford. Imagine my fella getting beat in spite of his great pitching by Schmitz, Casey said. Now, I ain't got anything against Schmitz personally, but he has no right pitching a 3-hit shutout against us. If he beats us again, I'll kiss you in Macy's window and pay your way to Europe and back. When my big, strong right-handed hitters can't hit a left-hander like him, I gotta do something. The next time, I'll send in all left-handed hitters against him, especially ones who'll make him pitch and not go chasing those squibs and sliders he suckers them with. I bring this up because it's exactly the opposite of what happened to the Milwaukee Brewers in the series out of which they were just swept by the Los Angeles Dodgers. There were no junk balling left-handers making them look foolish with off-speed stuff. There was just a Dodgers rotation on a roll, allowing 1 run a day for 4 straight days. And I feel bad for the Milwaukee Brewers and their manager because they really had a fun, deep team. There wasn't an Ohtani-type player in the center of it. Just everybody was pretty good, above average. Unfortunately, their rotation was not set up. They had to go with an opener a couple of times. And their offense in the regular season was below average in home runs, but tied for the league lead in batting average and was above average in walks. And of course, led the league in stolen bases as well. So you have to chain up hits if you're the Milwaukee Brewers. And, well, it's hard to do that against a starting staff of this quality. No Johnny Schmitz is here. Again, no offense to Johnny Schmitz, wherever he may now be. And here's the thing. It didn't have to be that way. Tyler Glasnow did not have a 1.6 ERA in the regular season. Yoshinobu Yamamoto did not have a 1 ERA in the regular season. Blake Snell did not have a 0 ERA in the regular season. And Shohei Ohtani's ERA was closer to 3 than 0. It's just that for 4 days, whoever picked up the dice shot a 7 on the first try. Every time. And what do you call that? Where have you gone? When, no matter what you do, the other guy is suddenly, somehow, magically, miraculously better than you when you haven't done anything wrong, but somehow you can't do anything right either. Well, you've arrived somewhere very special. And there's a name for that gray land, though you won't find it on any map. But those who have been there know it well. They speak of it to each other only in hushed, awed whispers. Yes, the Milwaukee Brewers have found themselves dwelling in the infinite inning. Well, hello there. You might also say the Milwaukee Brewers have found themselves dwelling in the off-season, and I honestly do feel bad about that. Had the Brewers and the Mariners advanced to the World Series, we would have been guaranteed that one team that has never won a championship would win one. Unless, of course, Rob Manfred decides to kick off his planned lockout of a year from now a little early. Let's hope not. As it is, I keep reflecting on the fact that we will have that hanging over us, sword of Damocles like, for the entirety of the 2026 season. It's a real downer of a thought, especially when you are thrilling to things like Shohei Ohtani cruising around the bases for the third time on the evening, having put enough miles on a ball that he's probably earned a frequent flyer vacation to go home, basically. As I speak these words to you, we're still a couple of days at minimum from knowing if the Mariners or the Blue Jays will represent the American League in the World Series. All those scenarios have some appeal, right? The Blue Jays have not won a World Series in over 30 years, so they're certainly due. Again, the Mariners never have. This is a matchup of the 1977 expansion teams. So you really would say that the Mariners, they really should say to the Blue Jays, look, you've done this. You've checked this box off. We both showed up at the same time. We both made our share of mistakes. Can we have a chance, please? But of course, it doesn't work that way. And then on the other hand, we haven't had a repeat champion in 25 years, since the Yankees did their three-peat thing from 1998 through 2000. And the Dodgers have a chance to do that if they win their second World Series in a row. I realize everyone hates the overdog. I realize that everyone gets mad at the Dodgers for how much they spend. I think that anger is somewhat misplaced. We can unpack that another time because, as I said, we're pressed today. It's late on the East Coast of America, but look, that would be whether you approve of it or not, approve of their methods, that is. A historic achievement of a different kind, again, given a quarter of a century between repeat winners. There's a lot of entropy that affects baseball teams nowadays, and for them to surmount that, however transiently, even for 2 years, especially with how shaky they looked at times this season, that is something worth looking forward to should it happen. Let's quickly run through this week's bulletin board bit. This week at Baseball Prospectus, I wrote a story. It's still up on the front page, although you have to scroll down a bit. It's called Mike Shildt and the One More Thing, and I used Mike Shildt's resignation as manager of the San Diego Padres to write at length about something I actually talked about here on the show very briefly, way back in its first year. And that was a kind of, traumatic is probably overstating it, but upsetting incident from my high school career. And I think nowadays they would actually call it sexual harassment. It was by another guy, and it took place in the gym locker room pretty much every day for a while. And I call it the story of the naked gym guy. Every day before and after class, he would strip down to his bright white jockey shorts, take out a huge roll of cash, hold it about where his genitals would have been, and aggressively fondle it while shouting at me, "Do you like that?" I'm sorry. It was very strange. It's still very strange. I didn't know the guy at all. He wasn't a rival or an enemy or anything. I went to a large high school. I never had a single class with the guy. We had no friends in common. But the point is, the reason that I went into this is because some of the coverage of Shildt's resignation talked about, very fleetingly, the effect that getting death threats from online gamblers had in essentially making him lose his joy in this job. And it seemed to me that it was very similar to this time in my life where I was having difficulties at home, difficulties in school, difficulties with my dating life, and then out of nowhere, this naked guy comes along with his wad of cash and is just very strangely aggressive for no reason, twice a day, not at any other times. As I say in the story, he didn't say, "I'll meet you after the bell," he just came in, did his thing, and he left. And as you know, I'm not very religious, but if someone had walked up to me at that point and had said, "You're already under so much strain, my son, but God is testing you with this one more thing. God has sent the naked gym guy and his pornographic roll of money," I would have believed them, or at least I would have said, "Yeah, it seems reasonable. Good supposition on your part. You probably still won't see me in the pews because I like to sleep in weekends. I like to sleep in weekdays as well. That's partly why I'm in so much trouble right now, but it is a good metaphor for what I'm going through." Thank you, Ringo Starr. I don't know why I imagined it as Ringo Starr. I'm a little punchy right now because, again, late hours are not unfamiliar to me, but it's hard not to be giddy when you look back at an incident like that, a series of incidents, because it went on and on and on, and not feel like you have to laugh because otherwise you start reliving the stress. And it seemed to me that Mike Shildt, if you do read the full coverage of what happened, was not getting along with his GM, was not getting along with the coaches, was not getting along with the media. And you could say, okay, that's nothing new for Mike Schilt. We know that about him. But then you say, okay, here's one more brick, death threats. Well, maybe that's what pushed him over the edge. And similarly, I was holding on until the naked gym guy showed up. And I did eventually, I guess. I'm here talking to you now. I got through it. I also didn't have the option to resign and go home, but Mike Schilt did. I'll tell you one more thing. No one left any comments on that story. Usually I get a number of them, but no one said anything. If you happen to read it, leave me a note. I know you're not supposed to read the comments if you're a writer. I kind of like the comments, especially when they're complimentary. I am that needy. My ego is that weak. So if you do read it, scrawl something on the wall, okay? And let me know that you were there. One final note on this that came up just this very second. I have my phone here on my desk. It's well off to the side, both because some frequency in it occasionally interferes with the microphone while I'm talking to you, and I also like to give you my full attention, so I don't need any of its pop-ups or flashing lights or anything else distracting me. That said, I like to keep it around because sometimes my kids are out of the house, or my elderly mom might need to contact me on an emergency basis, so it and I are never too far apart. Well, I glanced over there just now as I was telling you all about the naked gym guy, and I see that the phone is lit up, and there's this wall of text climbing up the screen and scrolling off. So I picked it up, and it turned out that my phone was worried about me. Some combination of words that I just spoke to you awoke some AI aspect of my phone, and it started listening as if it were in therapy mode. So I pick it up, I look down at the wall of text, and the first words from my phone are, "It seems like you've been through something very traumatic." Well, yeah, thank you, Mr. Phone, and maybe you could help out Mike Schilt too. Where the hell were you when I needed you, though? Would you like me to use my taser function to shock Mr. Naked Gym Guy? Yes, please. I'll tell you a secret. I have no idea what happened to that guy. I never saw him again after a certain point. Glory, glory, hallelujah. But I know this. Every single time I talk about it, I get a tiny bit of revenge. Dude, whatever your issues were, you shouldn't have picked on a guy who writes. Okay, despite my best intentions, I've talked us through to pretty much the point in the show that we normally take a break. So let's do that. Before we do, let me say of our second story that it is very much a baseball tale, that it reflects events primarily of 60 years ago, but it still feels very current to me. And finally, that it was provoked by this week's reissue episode. This week's reissue episode revisited, I think it was episode 76. And my guest was Stephen Johnson, who had written a column at the time for the Amsterdam News, a historic black newspaper, about what it was like to be a fan of color at that time. This was about 8 years ago. If you listen to my comments in this section, the same section of the show, back then, it sounds very quaint because the world of race relations that we live in now is not the same one that we lived in then. And part of it is that George Floyd happened almost 2 years after I recorded that episode. And so things changed. And there was a reaction and a counter-reaction. And we're still living in the aftermath of both. And that got me to thinking about one of the prior times that what we used to call race riots, very much a misnomer, because they're often very one-sided, had caused a realignment of politics. And that brought me to Los Angeles in 1965, and I was surprised to learn there was some baseball as part of the fallout. I'd enjoy telling you about that, should you allow it, and I hope you do, because I'm going to begin doing so right after this brief intermission. Just over 60 years ago, on August 11th, 1965, the Watts neighborhood in South Los Angeles went up in flames as William O'Neill wrote in Coming Apart, an informal history of the 60s. 5 days later, 34 people were dead, 4,000 more under arrest, and much of Watts in ashes. Stores had been looted and burned. Firemen who tried to save them were driven off by snipers. It took 14,000 National Guardsmen to restore order. There were many explanations put forward at the time. Chief Parker blamed civil rights workers and nameless conspirators. Mayor Samuel W. Yorty blamed the communists. As with riots taking place closer to our time, this one seems to have begun with a police stop of a black motorist, 3 men in a car actually, by cops for drunk driving, and the interaction turned violent. Rumors about just how violent it was exceeded the initial reality. It was said that the cops had punched or kicked a pregnant woman in the stomach, which hadn't happened. A crowd gathered, the cops lost control of the scene, the onlookers began throwing things at them, and matters spiraled. As I just told you, this went on for days. A lot of it was broadcast live across the country, and like other events of its kind, although I believe this was the biggest to that point, it was shocking to the mainstream, white audience. And while it's very hard to mind read people, particularly backwards by more than half a century, it does seem like the attitude on the part of the mainstream was, didn't we just pass the Voting Rights Act? Weren't we supposed to be done with all this friction now? Which is, of course, naive. And it should go without saying that violence, whether justified or not, whether you have a point or not, is always triggering for people, always causes a counter-reaction, as I said earlier. And I say that because one of the traps we fall into when we talk about incidents like this is who is really at fault. Was Eric Garner, who died saying, "I can't breathe," when police pinned him down on July 17th, 2014, he was stopped for selling illegal cigarettes. Yeah, true. He was committing some sort of a crime. Did he resist arrest? Seems like it. Did George Floyd attempt to pass a fake $20 bill on May 25th, 2020? Well, that was the charge. Did he even know it was a fake $20 bill? If you went to a store and just pulled a 20 out of your wallet without looking too closely, would you know? Do you check every bit of change that you're given? Of course not. Well, put that aside. The point is that, yes, they were doing illegal things, but we do have rights, or we did until recently. We have due process. We do not empower cops to kill people for misdemeanor crimes or even most felonies. So if you say that everything was the victim's fault because they were criminals, then you've reduced morality and justice to, he started it, and implicitly, you're okay with whatever happens to you the next time a traffic cop with a quota to meet pulls you over for going 40 miles per hour in a 35 mile per hour zone. In Watts, in 1965, the young man who was pulled over, 21-year-old Marquette Fry, may well have been driving while intoxicated. He was convicted of that after, and he may well have resisted arrest. I don't know if the police used appropriate force in responding to him or not. I don't know what provoked the crowd. I know at the time, people pointed to a lot of negatives about the predominantly black neighborhood of Watts. It was suffering from, among other things, 30% unemployment among adult males and an old and decrepit housing stock. It was primarily a ghetto. Simultaneously, the police department was something like 95% white. It was headed by an out racist, the aforementioned Chief Parker, and it didn't have the greatest reputation among the community for that reason. After the initial incident, Chief Parker dismissed it by saying something like, "One monkey started throwing things and all the other monkeys wanted to do it too." Very classy. He sounds almost as if he could have been a member of the Young Republicans. The photographs of the guys in that chat, I hope you do know what I'm referring to. If not, look it up, have had me humming Spike Jonze Der Fuhrer's face all week. The problem with pointing to those things as a reason for most of a week of fires and violence is that it's excusing a non sequitur. You can say this group has been abused. This group has legitimate frustrations. This group feels unrepresented and unheard. But that doesn't necessarily, or at all, give that group license to set fire to its own neighborhood or any part of the city. And it's counterproductive for them, even if they think that that's a reasonable response. As we've outlined earlier, one of the things that happened both during the Watts riots and George Floyd was that white people went out and bought a ton of guns. I want to hasten to say that I think the Watts riots and the George Floyd events were very different things. I wasn't around for the Watts riots, but I did watch, as most of the nation did, the George Floyd protests. And it seemed to me that, unlike descriptions of the Watts riots, that most of the violence, I'm not saying all, but a good deal of the violence that we saw on television actually came from the authorities. It was not instigated by the protesters. I think in both cases, the origins of the violence are the same, because why would police want to make a peaceful protest more dangerous for everyone involved, including them? That's contra the point of having police. Similarly, you may be frustrated with a situation. You may want to break things, but the upshot of breaking your own things is that once you're done, you have less than what you started with, and you probably didn't start with a lot. Plus, you've alienated many people who might otherwise have been sympathetic. Now, I'm going to venture an answer, again, as to why both sides would act contrary to their own interests. And it may well be, you may well say, gee, Steve, this is a trite explanation. And I'll tell you, normally, I would go through, before I said this sort of thing to you, a handful of books on mob psychology, seeing if it was a valid thought or not, and then I'd give you what I learned. I haven't done that this time. I just want to go with my gut this once. And the reason for that is that we're witnessing something on the streets of America today where our government has empowered a certain group of people to be very cruel to another group of people in the same way. Maybe not to the same extent, not to the same murderous extent yet, but in a similar way to how the Nazi government took ordinary people out of Germany, out of Poland, out of Ukraine, and made them gods over outgroups. You know who those outgroups were. And they committed mass murder in a way that under other systems they would not. And it wasn't just because they were following orders. I'm not saying that. It was because, in many cases, there was something inherent to them that allowed them to follow those orders, allowed them to participate in that system and not think very hard about it. And in some cases, probably feel pretty good about it. And it seems to me that a lot of what we think of as civilization is just a veneer. In any group of us, there are those looking for permission to act out and break things. It's just the law of averages. Just as we can gather any 100 people, let's say, and line them up by height, and find that of the 100, some are above average in height and some are below average in height. There are going to be people who are fine with society's strictures and structures, including the prohibition on hurting others, even if they're different from you. And at the high end of the distribution, there are people who would never think of doing anything like that ever. It wouldn't occur to them to cross the street against the light, never mind inflict violence on their fellow human. And then there are people on the other end of the spectrum who are barely restrained by our structures or resent them or who are incapable of being restrained by them. And those are the people we call sociopaths. And often they commit enough violations that in normal times they go to jail. When people get angry, whether you consider that anger justified or not, it doesn't matter. All of the restraints on them weaken. And as I just said, some of them don't have very strong restraints to begin with. I'll tell you a personal story. I don't get truly angry very often. That was a skill I had to learn because I certainly came with a temper installed. And when I do get very angry, I have this urge to throw things. There's a physical component to it, to the energy that seems to be generated in my body at those times. I don't have the urge to hurt anyone, thank goodness. But that energy wants to be discharged. And on those really rare occasions that I've gotten away from myself, if something's at hand, it just seems very natural to pick it up, and you get the idea. As a teenager, as a young adult, I used to give in to that urge sometimes. Or, more often, say the mean, sharp, cutting thing when I could have tried to diffuse the situation. When I could have used that same creativity and ability to speak and communicate to say something constructive, or kind, or simply calm. Because who do you argue with most often in your life? The people who are around you most often. Who is around you most often? The people who you care about and who care about you. So why would you want to wound them, even if they have in that moment wounded you? It took me a stupidly long time to reason this out. And there was an occasion when I was 18 or 19 when I got that way into that very bitter mood and I said something cruel to someone, and I've been ashamed of it ever since. It wasn't a slur. It wasn't anything bigoted. It was just very cruel and very personal. And I saw the look in that person's eyes. And I thought, do I want people to look at me that way? And so right there, I embraced the shame that I felt. It was actually constructive shame, which is a pretty rare thing in life. And I changed, I hope, for the better. And eventually, a long time later, I reached out to that person and I apologized. And they said, I don't remember what you're talking about, so it must not have been that bad. But that was a mercy. I hope they were just being kind. I mean, I hope both in a way. And that doesn't mean that I never became angry again, right? Life has a lot of annoyances. So flash forward a few years, and I'm in a relationship with the woman who became my wife, my best friend. And we had an argument about something. We've always argued very rarely. I've been very fortunate in that way. So it's hard to imagine what it was even about. But in that moment, I had that same energy again, the energy that had to be let out. And I flipped over our kitchen table, our very first kitchen table. I was probably 24 years old. We had just moved in together. I was 23 or 24 when we did that. And again, I saw the way that this person that I loved so much, and I knew loved me so much, was looking at me. She had never seen me like that. And I knew it had never occurred to her that I could be like that. And she was asking herself, have I misunderstood this person? And I vowed to myself right then that I would never disillusion her like that ever again. Which is not to say that we have never argued again in all the years since, or that I have never been angered by something or someone. And did I fail to be the best person I could be in some of those moments? Yeah, I did. But that was the last time I acted out in that way, because very simply, it's not who I choose to be. At the risk of sounding as if I'm patting myself on the back, there are a lot of people who never get outside of themselves that way and realize that by losing control, they're losing themselves and diminishing themselves in the eyes of others. In fact, some relish the opportunity. They lean into it. And when they see structures that restrain us weakening, they let themselves off the leash. In many cases, they were barely on it to begin with. And that's when they take liberties. They also take televisions from shattered storefront windows. And if in any given group of people, this is not about race, this is just about a collection, a sample. To borrow from Leo DeRocher one more time, doesn't matter if they're black, white, or striped like a zebra. They could be all Asian, they could be all white, they could be all black, they could be all Native American, they could be all Martian, it could be a melange of all of the above. If in that sampling of people, you have too many who are of below average self-restraint, then they're going to riot. They're going to give themselves permission to rampage. And of course, in a large enough group, when we're talking about thousands and thousands of people, they could just be citizens of a place. They could be police. They could be wearing a National Guard uniform. The larger the sample, the larger the distributions, right? The more people we have, the more of them are going to be sorted to the extreme law-abiding side and the extreme chaotic side. Once someone throws the first rock, the lawful people are still the lawful people, but the chaotic people say, woohoo, and they go to town. A world run by intelligent people might recognize this and not give people reason to go off the chain. It would try to anticipate their frustrations and meet them in the middle somewhere. And that's why, when we come full circle and start arguing about causes of violence, it sounds really weak to say, well, they were poor and had been pushed around by the cops, and they were just frustrated as an explanation, because what we're really doing is looking for places where the structures that keep us doing our regular day-to-day thing weaken and give people permission to act out. And acting out, by the way, that is very different from protest. Protest is actually the opposite of riot, although, for the reasons I just explained, protest can become a riot, but then so can a soccer game or a concert. Again, it depends on who is given permission to do what. And if you're looking at something like Kent State, again, it was the authorities who lost control, not the kids. The kids just died. Watts, as I said earlier, was finally calmed by a combination of a curfew and an influx of police and National Guardsmen. There was, by the way, no federalization of the latter. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara did write up the executive order for President Lyndon Johnson to give him that power to deploy the military into Los Angeles, but they never used it. I want to tell you in advance that the rest of this story, the baseball part, is funny in places. You may laugh at it. I did, and I immediately felt ashamed. The truth is, it is funny. It was funny to me in part because my wife, who seems to be coming up a lot tonight, hi Steffi, has had a long career with startup technology companies, and what is always fascinating to me to observe is how people often don't know what they don't know. It's always obvious in retrospect, but it's fascinating how the entrepreneurs involved don't know it and then deny what they don't know. Somehow what they don't know is always a cost center. Recently, we watched one of the documentaries about the mini sub that imploded on its way to running rich tourists down to the Titanic a few years ago. The man behind that business had, well, more of a clue how to build a deep-sea diving vessel than you or I do, but not more than the experts he hired. And they kept telling him that his design was fatally flawed. There are scenes in that documentary when engineers are running tests of miniature versions of his sub, and you hear it fail. And that sound is chilling, both because you know it anticipates what is going to happen to actual live human beings, including that founder of the company, and thus in refusing the information that is being placed in front of him that he is in fact paying for, he is committing an act of hubris that would embarrass an ancient Greek playwright. And his response is not, "You are wrong, and I will tell you why," using data and statistics and other information that suggest to me that our experiment is flawed. His answer is simply, no. At one point, my wife was involved with building a box, and you would think that a box is a well-understood technology. But it turns out that building a box is very complicated, and in fact, it's complicated in some of the same ways that building a deep-sea diving vessel is complicated. Because if the ends don't meet right, they're going to fail. And if you don't apply the glue to the ends right, they're going to fail. Fortunately for me and our children, my wife was conducting these experiments not at 20,000 leagues under the sea, but on dry land, and the worst thing that happened with a failure, the worst consequence beyond the boss, the rich guy in charge, being annoyed, is that you would have a mess to clean up. Whatever was in the box was no longer in the box. Different deal if you're captain of the Nautilus and you're responsible for the lives of others. There is a tiny little bit of, well, the box version in this story. No one was hurt, but technology failed. Not just technology, but people, because their intentions outweighed their capacity to execute them. And in that sense, it's a bit of a tragedy because they really were good intentions. And so, on the other side of this break, I will tell you the brief tale of the California Golden Oaks baseball bat. In another timeline, Shohei Ohtani would have hit 3 home runs with one of those tonight. In the aftermath of the riots, a lot of well-meaning people decided that what Watts needed was investment. Others, less well-meaning, decided that what California needed was law and order and elected Ronald Reagan to the governorship. In the book Nixonland, Rick Perlstein, and I really recommend this book, by the way, argues that it was also the reaction to the Watts riots instrumental in electing Richard Nixon to the presidency. Big baseball fan, Richard Nixon. Oh well, nobody's perfect. Perfectly flawed, I mean. That said, if he's somewhere where the energy that once was Richard Nixon can observe what's happening to our nation, he must be, well, laughing his butt off, I would imagine, or finding reason to be even more bitter than he was. His argument about Watergate was, if the president does it, it's not illegal. At the time, everybody went, ew. Now, via our Supreme Court, that is the law. It's just true. So Watts, in Nixon's home state of California, required investment, and what one well-meaning fellow from Compton, an African-American entrepreneur named Norm Hodges, an engineer who had run an aircraft materials testing program, decided that the kind of investment needed was industry. It needed a factory to provide jobs. Specifically, it needed a baseball bat factory. He wanted to manufacture a special bat, the Watts Walloper. There was, sometime in the early part of the 20th century, a boxer known as the Watts Walloper. I don't know if he was channeling that guy or just like the alliteration. The Watts Walloper was going to give a lot of people jobs. He recruited over 150 co-investors most or all of them black. Dodgers Lou Johnson and Johnny Roseboro got on board, and he started the Green Power Foundation. He also got endorsements from big leaguers from out of town, like Curt Flood and Leon Wagner. Don Newcomb was on the board. They rented a building, something barely standing, for $1 a year, borrowed $50,000, bought some lathes, and then they started hiring. Hodges' plan was to give the first shot to people who struggled the most to get jobs, convicted criminals. The joke was, Hodges told the Los Angeles Times much later, you had to have 30 arrests to start. This was a very noble idea. Hodges, who manufactured the bats under the name California Golden Oaks Products, got a lot of positive attention for it. By the 1970s, he had enough local clout to run for the congressional district representing Compton as a Republican. Had he won, said the Amsterdam Times, he would have become, quote, the first black Republican member of the U.S. House of Representatives since Oscar DePriest of Chicago, who served from 1928 through 1935. This was 1976. He didn't win. It was a landslide for the Democratic incumbent, but it shows something that he was a candidate at all, particularly for a party that just had no interest in running people of color. There would be no black Republican member of the House of Representatives until 1991, a span of 56 years. That Norm Hodges' loss doesn't reflect poorly on him at all. I really came to like him learning about him, the little that I did. People would write things that are just amazing in retrospect. For example, after the assassination of Robert Kennedy in 1969, one columnist wrote that buying one of the bats would be an appropriate gesture of remembrance because, I quote, Robert Kennedy believed in things like the Watts Walloper. He knew that man needs the dignity of a job more than he needs the shame of a welfare check. Alas, Hodges' idea didn't work. Green Power was able to make bats. It just wasn't able to make good bats. It wasn't just the inexperienced employees, but the wood. The bats cracked on impact. Any impact. I want to let Green Power, probably Hodges, take it from here, because on May 9th, 1968, they took out a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times that was the 60s equivalent of a GoFundMe appeal. First, there is a picture of a tall, thin black man in a suit under large print that says, Billy Towels just bought a new suit. The last one he picked out cost him 6 months. Below that, the ad goes on to say, this is a story about 153 Negroes that have it made and 1 million who don't. The 153 are doctors, lawyers, physicists, businessmen, athletes, teachers, and engineers. They started Green Power. Their average income is $12,000 a year. And here they are, begging. Then there's another, smaller photo. It's a little hard to make out, but I think it's the Golden Oak workers on the factory floor. The text picks up again. If you've got the time, drive south on San Pedro Street, just north of 12th Street in South Los Angeles. There's a 2-story telephone company building with a roof that leaks when it rains. It's empty except for 6 lathes, 39 men, 2 girls in a makeshift office, and a pile of freshly turned baseball bats. Then there's a picture of the bat. It looks like a bat. It's a bit thicker at the top than we're used to nowadays. Baseball bats. Watts Wallopers. You've heard about them. Lou Johnson and John Roseboro have endorsed them. The Dodgers will give them away to all the youth leagues on every home run, every big play. The Watts Walloper has been written up in Sports Illustrated, Newsweek, The Wall Street Journal, The Times. Bill Stout did a brilliant CBS television show on the Green Power Foundation and wants to do another. Green Power has orders for thousands of Watts Wallopers from kids' baseball leagues, department stores, sporting goods companies, schools, and recreation departments. But they're not going to make it to first base if you don't help. They're not going to make it through June if they don't make it through May. They're pooped and they're broke. Listen. And now comes something I really admire, a kind of confession. A confession that Norm Hodges and friends had vastly overcomplicated what it was they were attempting to do in watts. Again, the intentions were good, the plan not so much. Listen, if you want to make a good baseball bat, you start with a good, hard Eastern white ash, right? Wrong. Not if you want to make bats in Southern California on no money. You start with plentiful, cheap California oak. It's terrible wood. You can cut it and ship it for next to nothing. But a scientist shows you how to treat it with safe radiation, change it into a hardwood. Then an aerospace expert shows you how to wind a thin filament of glass around the shaft so the grip is right and the bat is twice as strong. Okay, you're ready. Now you look for men that know how to make baseball bats. Good, dependable, skilled workers, right? Wrong again. If you think green power started with poor raw material for bats, look at the human raw material they picked. Losers, convicted criminals, former narcotics users, unskilled men who didn't believe in America because America didn't believe in them. All those human beings you don't like to think about. They believe in green power. You teach a man to make a baseball bat, but first you teach him to come to work every day, to come back after lunch. You teach him about a paycheck because he's never had one before. You pay him $2 an hour, and at the end of the week, he buys the second new suit he's ever had. And the cops pick him up because the last time he picked out a suit, the store was closed. So you go down to the station and tell the green power story again. You work with these men like you'd work with a polio case, and they begin to respond with small successes. You give them small shots of self-respect. They can't handle a big dose yet. That's where the time goes. That's where the money went. Now green power has a payroll and a pile of bats that aren't any good because these men didn't know how to make bats when they started. Now they do. And they're the nucleus of a 250-man payroll in June, if the place is still open. This is incredible, right? This is Norm Hodges, or someone who works for Norm Hodges, talking about their own effort and explaining what it is they're trying to do and why it went wrong. But again, it went wrong for noble reasons. It reminds me a bit of those Domino's commercials from a few years ago. People say our pizza's really bad, that it tastes like salty styrofoam. Well, we agree. We're trying to do better now. They ran those for forever. Like, how long does it take to figure it out? But at no point did they say, our pizzas were bad because we were cutting costs. We admit it, but we were cutting costs to send needy kids through college, to give people who wouldn't otherwise be employed jobs as delivery men and women. That would have been dishonest because the real answer was simply, we thought we could stretch our profit margins by scouring junkyards across America and recovering vinyl seat covers from discarded cars from the 60s, 70s, and 80s and then melting them over old bread instead of using cheese. Norm Hodges was different. Norm Hodges was saying, look, I tried to make baseball bats in California even though we don't have the right trees. So I tried to use science to make the trees better, which turned out to be a heavier lift than, well, just using trees. And then I hired people who were unhireable anywhere else and tried to get them to actually show up before I could teach them how to make bats, which again, I didn't have the right wood to do. So help! Then there's a kind of odd picture. I'll let the ad describe it. Send Green Power $10 and they'll send you half a bat. It will be on a plaque with your name on it. Hang one on your wall. And when people ask about it, give them the whole story. If you do business in South Los Angeles, buy one for each of your customers and have them put it up in their store or office. It translates quickly. It says, I'm with you. Or buy one for your son or your grandson's room and tell them what it's about. Tell them how 153 men got out of Watts and why they had to go back. And then there was a slip to clip and mail with your check. Here's a heartwarming thing. They made enough money off of that ad to pay off their loans and stay in business. But in the long run, they couldn't break into the bat business, not with California oak bats. For a while, they turned to straight furniture making, which was probably easier, but I don't think they're in business anymore. Hodges ended up in Kansas City, in fact, running a housing program for the poor, the 20 Good Men Volunteer Neighborhood Improvement Agency, which shows he stayed true to his values. The idea was to train people in the construction trade by putting them to work renovating decrepit housing stock. So once again, he was trying to teach people who couldn't get a job how to get a job. Then they would fund more efforts by selling those restored houses to low-income buyers. So the idea was to have a virtuous cycle. He died in 1992 in Kansas City. A lot of people give you wings, but very few give you wind and wings, said Veda Monday, a city councilwoman and co-founder of the 20 Good Men organization. His wind continues to blow. I really do wish his bats continued to swing, but in this case, it really is the thought that counts. Susan Rohrer, a friend of his, wrote in the Kansas City Star at the time of his death, "This man walked the talk. He wasn't good because he could get tax credits. He wasn't good because it was his job and he was getting paid for it. He wasn't good because someone told him to do it. Norm was just good for nothing," by which she meant no reason. It just was inherent to him. And he saw good in everyone. Our greatest tribute to this man, who touched us all, is to continue his work. That is our challenge, and that challenge is his legacy. We can cooperate with each other. We can work together. We can get the job done. We can continue his work. We can all be good for nothing. It is a good idea, isn't it? We can be together, as the Jefferson Airplane sang in 1969. It's a different idea than the one many of us subscribe to now, which is that we should be driven apart and set against each other. And in this case, this one time, the idea began with a baseball bat. If I had been around then, I'd like to think that I would have sent in my $10 for a half bat on a plaque. And as Norm wanted us to do, I would have told the story when people asked, "Why do you have a half bat on a plaque?" It would be like the end of Camelot. Each evening from December to December, before you brush your teeth and things like that, think back on all the tales that you remember of Calibat. Ask every person if he's heard the story, and tell it strong and clear to every cat that once there was a fleeting wisp of glory called Calibat. I really do believe that we can be together. The story you just heard is one that took me completely by surprise. I had other plans for this episode, but I felt like it needed to be told or wanted to be told. It's not always up to me. What's up to you is if you choose to follow me on social media, which you can do at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, bang, you're there. I did put up a picture of the half bat on a plaque. I wonder if they're still out there. Time to check eBay. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. But don't you feel odd when you pick up stuff that's been endorsed to other people? Say you want a picture signed by the late great actress Carol Lombard, but she endorsed it to Ralph, best wishes. Don't you feel a bit weird about that? Who's Ralph? Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of yourself and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, tell them Ralph sent you and do it anyway. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mourning, who says, "Today I choose not to quote myself, but the great Robert Heinlein, who wrote, 'A society adapts to facts, or it does not survive.' Spoken like a scientist. Well, if I can fend off the ghostly Ralph who just attempted to set fire to my bed despite the fact that he's intangible, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning." Serves me right calling out a ghost groupie like that.